want to take this forward now. We've actually got two issues to discuss with former Truth Commissioner Yasmin Sooka. She is, of course, also the Executive Director of the Foundation for Human Rights. And Yasmin, thank you very much for your time. While we are focusing on Brackenfell, let us start there. You know, the Truth Commission was a crucial starting point, I think, for our racial healing in South Africa. It brought into the open many of the awful crimes that were kept secret and committed under apartheid. But it was, in fact, just a beginning. When you look at the angry scenes that we have seen outside Brackenfell High, protesting against allegations of racism, what are your thoughts on the success of the process of the TRC? Did you expect us to be further along the road of reconciliation than we are currently?
The challenge really, of course, is that while the Truth Commission did well on the question of what one calls civil and political rights violations, you know, we documented the atrocities which amounted to what I call a crime against humanity and which was recognized as such globally. What the Truth Commission didn't do well is really deal with what I call the systemic or structural violations of apartheid, and that is really around privilege, economic access, the question of education, the land question also, and of course white benefit and privilege. The Truth Commission, of course, was also supposed to lay a foundation, which it did, but what it really expected was the government to take up its recommendations and ensure that we have a transformation of our country, both in terms of the economy and also in terms of race and poverty and inequality, which is racially, I think, a challenge in our country. Unfortunately, of course, what we haven't seen is leadership on this issue then and now. And that is why I think when you look at racial politics in our country, we're a deeply divided society because we haven't dealt with these unfinished questions. And I have to agree then with the foundation's statement that these remain unresolved issues. And I think what is glaringly obvious is the fact that nobody has stepped forward. And in that vacuum, this allows, I think, the scenes that we see at Brackenfell, in fact, to take place.
What sort of statement would calm it down? You know, we've had some statements from the school saying, first of all, that this so-called white matric dance wasn't only white kids. There were also coloured children there. That's what we are hearing. But then we're also hearing that there are incidents of racism at the school, that there are comments made about coloured children that are completely unacceptable. Whether it's unconscious bias, racism, however you want to explain it, it shows a fundamental lack of understanding, certainly it seems on the part of some white teachers, allegedly at this stage, of what needed to change after apartheid. You say, that you agree with the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation that there's a failure of leadership at the school, but haven't we got a broader failure of leadership in our country? And that is why we're seeing polarization and populism coming into our political rhetoric.
Well, you know, South Africa hosted the Durban Conference on Racism more than 20 years ago. And, you know, at that conference, it was agreed that every country would deal with a racial transformation project through establishing a national action plan to combat racism. Now, South Africa, in fact, handed its plan to the United Nations in 2018, but they've never really committed to setting up a proper plan on racial transformation, because you can't, with a stroke of a pen, change the psyche of a nation or the culture of a nation. And what we see in South Africa today is a lack of understanding or acceptance, really, of our colonial and apartheid past, and really to accept the need for decolonization, including in our schools. And so this is where I see the government of South Africa failing to lead us on these issues, and that is why the education departments continue business as usual without really looking at educational programs in which we begin to understand racism, we begin to acknowledge what that actually means in terms of privilege, and we also begin to look at how do we have transformative justice in our schools and in our society. And the outbreak you see, and I mean, this is just a symptom of the systemic question of racism in our country.
Absolutely. And, you know, the anger that we're seeing, I wonder as well if it's not because of what has not been dealt with. And this leads me to the other issue that I wanted to discuss with you this evening, the ANC making a call that cases that came before the TRC but that were never finalised when the Commission ended in 2002, that these matters which were handed to the NPA now must be wrapped up. And there's a lot of agreement that this needs to happen. Do you think that this process is actually vital? It seems like it's going backwards, but do you think it's absolutely vital to heal and move us forward in 2020 in South Africa?
Well, you know, it's important, I think, to look at the historical background on this. You know, in 1998, when the Commission completed its work, it handed over a list of 300 cases to the NPA for further investigation with a view to prosecution. It took us 16 years to actually get the NPA to indict the first death squad in South Africa in the Nokuthula Simelane matter. And we were supposed to go to trial in October this year, and for some reason it was postponed. But the ANC statement is, of course, the product of a discussion that we've been having between the Foundation for Human Rights, the families of victims, and the legal teams over the last 2 months in order to get their political support to ensure that, in fact, we're able to establish a dedicated team to deal with future investigations and prosecutions. We are in a race against time. Family members are in their late 80s and some of them in their 90s. And of course, when we look at the perpetrators, they are aging too. Last week, Friday, in the Timor appeal, we were in the Supreme Court of Appeal arguing the question of whether the rights of Jean Rodrigues to fair trial processes were in fact compromised by the fact that the NPA took so many years to indict him. So this is an important process for the rule of law in our country, because it was always understood that amnesties are abnormal in a rule of law society. But the special circumstances in our country to allow the transition to proceed necessitated that very generous amnesty. But it was also clear in the law that if you did not apply for amnesty or you were refused amnesty, then the law would follow its course. And I think this is where the government and, of course, the NPA have to explain to our country what was the political interference that in fact stopped them from investigating or prosecuting, and why has it been left up to the families of victims to bring the pressure to bear and to investigate these cases? Because none of the cases that you see out in the courts, the Timor indictment, the Simelane matter, the Agate inquest, all of these matters have come about because of the tenacity of the families of victims and because of the pro bono work of the legal teams and the support rendered by the foundation. And without that, we would be sitting in a country where there is absolute impunity. And so while the ANC statement is to be welcomed, we need this political support to ensure that the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Police make the resources necessary to put a dedicated team in the NPA to ensure that these cases are dealt with as a matter of priority. This is fundamental to the restoration of the rights of victims, and of course the question of impunity in our country, which I think we see is a challenge because of the lack of prosecutions on so many levels.
You're so right, and thank you so much for your time this evening. We really do appreciate it. That is former Truth Commissioner Yasmin Sooka, also Executive Director of the Foundation for Human Rights. 300 cases handed to the NPA when the Truth Commission wrapped up its work, and very little progress since then.